I've just been introduced. I'm with Flux Trends, and what we do is we do corporate foresight and trend analysis. We tend to work more with businesses than with policymakers at government level, but we still sometimes do some work with some government organizations too. But my background personally comes from both a combination of marketing and economics, as well as foresight, so I've got a little bit of an unusual lens on the world. And generally, when I tend to apply my mind to foresight work to facilitate change, there's two things in particular that I need to look at, or that I like to look at. Firstly, that would be, what are the trade-offs that are involved in the choices that our clients are trying to make? In other words, choice architecture. And that really comes a lot from my economics background, which understands that almost every choice does come with some sort of scarcity, and there is a trade-off with almost every single decision that we need to make. And the second part of my sort of foresight work that I like to do is I like to ask the question about incentives. How are we designing systems and structures with the correct incentives to create sustainable futures that actually come to fruition and then aid us in our chosen choices that we have determined in the first part of the analysis? Now, just to move on, hopefully I can get these slides to work here. As I said, my talk today is about interesting times and surviving through chaos in particular. So we are definitely in the midst of interesting times at the moment. The question, of course, then becomes, now what? And in order to do that, we can talk a little bit about chaos theory itself. So chaos theory is really the study of unpredictable systems. Now, in chaos theory, systems are unpredictable not because they are random or because they rely on fate or the gods or anything like that. Rather, chaotic systems are unpredictable simply because they are so complex. And that means that even very small measurement errors or very small gaps in our understanding can end up creating a huge divergence between our predicted outcomes and the real outcomes that we see in the world. So I thought that this chart that I found on Twitter really sums that up quite well, to show that very small measurement error can end up with a completely crazy future looking ahead. And that can make us feel very, very uncomfortable when we're in the midst of periods of particularly chaotic or particularly fast-moving change. However, our job as futurists and foresight practitioners is to encourage people to zoom out a little bit and to look at the bigger picture. Because when we do that, we see that as much as it's very difficult to predict the future or specifics, particularly in the short term, when we start to zoom out a little bit further, we can see that mega trends and grand challenges are still in play. And in fact, these larger mega trends that we've been tracking over a very long time, we're talking about generational periods, many years, decades, cycles, rather than just particular crises, we can see that that is the direction the future is still heading in. It's our job to try and survive the immediate future when we are in a period of chaos, but without losing sight of those larger trends that are still in play. Because crises, particularly that of the pandemic that we find ourselves in now, tend to rather accelerate and highlight the trends already in play, rather than necessarily create new ones in the short term. In the short term, right now, we are dealing with the ideas that are lying around. So as Milton Friedman said in this great quote I have over here, only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When crises occur, the actions that are taken depend on those ideas that are lying around. And I think this is a very profound statement for times of chaos and crisis like we find ourselves in now, because it is both a threat and a promise. It's a threat in that if the ideas that are lying around at the moment are not good ideas, we can end up creating a lot of harm in the future as those chaotic systems play out, and small changes and small actions today end up making very big consequences, unintended consequences further down the line. At the same time, there's a promise in that quote too, in that it is an opportunity to be deliberate and proactive about changing systems that we don't want to carry forward into the future. Now, before I go on, I just wanted to make a note about the difference between mental and physical preparedness for things like crises. So I know a lot of speakers here at the summit have been speaking about black swans and whether the pandemic was or was not a black swan and all the rest of it. But I think that there is room for a conversation to be had, particularly among some of the smaller corporate clients that I deal with quite a lot, about the practicalities of being prepared for every eventuality, and the difference between being prepared for anything and being prepared for every particular thing. So I've got a couple of examples here to illustrate that thought a bit further. The first one will be that of Wimbledon, who quite famously this week we saw in the news, just got an insurance payout of $141 million that they'd taken out specifically against the eventuality of a pandemic. So you might say they're very foresighted for doing that and they were correctly prepared, but that preparation came at a huge practical cost. I mean, I think they paid in something like $34 million into that insurance policy without knowing that they would ever have to do it. And quite frankly, when it comes to constrained budgets and things like trade-offs, the question really is that we can't be prepared for every single thing, because preparing for one thing means that we're going to be less prepared for the next thing. And as I say, I'm based in South Africa. We have a very limited budget in our government. We have a very limited fiscus. Not only are we dealing with the pandemic, we're also dealing with being downgraded to junk status at the moment. And that means that there was only so far that anyone could have been prepared for this particular crisis. And for that reason, I want to say that perhaps what we're lacking in preparedness is not predictions, because people did know there was a possibility of a crisis such as this. Rather, what we lacked was mental preparedness. So we lacked the mental fortitude and the leadership, the proactive leadership, to be able to make the right choices based on the information and the predictions that futurists have been speaking about for a very, very long time. So I don't think it's a communication problem so much as it is an action and a leadership vacuum that we're finding ourselves with at the moment. No one is willing to step up to make the choices that are required to see us through periods of extreme chaos and crisis. Following on from that thought, I think that our role as futurists also is to get people comfortable with a certain degree of chaos and of change, because change is of course perpetual. It's not something that we go through. Once the COVID crisis is past, there will be another one. It might not be a pandemic. It might be the plague that's going on in North Africa at the moment that might grow into something of large global consequence. It might be something we haven't thought of for a long time, perhaps the emergence of the threat to something like nuclear warfare, perchance. But the point is that there's always going to be change. There's always going to be chaos. That's why our role is to try and get people to be comfortable with constant change so that they can make decisions from a place of calm and a place of well-researched decisions. But at the same time, there's also a danger of letting people slip into complacency in the face of chaos. So once again, I want to use my country as an example, because South Africa has lurched from one crisis to the next. For really as long as I've been alive, there's been the end of apartheid and the threat of civil war breaking out in the country. There was the AIDS crisis that decimated a large proportion of our population. There was the more recent state capture crisis that we went through. And so we seem to be lurching from one crisis to the next. We also have a massive crime problem. And when you combine all of that chaotic living together, what you find is we've got a nation of people who are essentially suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Now that means that we have become probably too comfortable with chaos and a bit too complacent, in that we just accept disasters as they come upon us rather than being proactive actioners of our own destiny going forward. And that's of course the balance that we need to find between comfort and complacency, and that's a large part of our role as people in the futures space, to try and get that difference between understanding what we do have control over, what we don't have control over, and make sure that we are actioning as best as we can within the confines, the creative confines of a very tight brief that nature and the environment and the economy really tend to throw at us. Following on from that thought, I also think it's quite important, particularly once again in chaotic systems and in chaotic times, to consider the concept of skin in the game. And this comes back to the sort of incentives that we're designing and sort of trade-offs that we are choosing when it comes to acting and reacting to crises. I think we've got quite a large problem in the world at large, whether you're looking at the individual level, the organizational level, or even the national and governmental level, and that we have a skin in the game problem in that the upside and downside risks and rewards of choices and decisions that are being made in the marketplace are not equitably distributed between citizens, governments, corporates, and employees, for example. So at a political level, we've perhaps not designed a very resilient system, in that our party politics models, particularly in the more democratic Western nations, they are designed on a sort of 4 or 5 year election cycle, meaning that governments and leaders have quite a short horizon plan that they are planning towards. This makes us constantly working in the reaction space rather than the proactive, longer term mega trend space. Similarly, in the corporate space, you've also got a short-term bad lack of incentive or lack of skin in the game problem in the way that we've designed our current capitalist system, particularly with regards to things like financialization and buybacks of shares that encourage, once again, short-term thinking amongst our leaders rather than long-term thinking. And we can, of course, turn that on its head as well and say that perhaps citizens are not getting necessarily equitable upside or downside risk for the sort of choices that are being made on their behalf. So I think that it's also important for us, if we are going to have effective foresight, is to help people, whether those are corporate organizations or governmental organizations, design systems that ensure that skin in the game, that risk and reward is equally distributed so that those systems become more resilient and have less unintended consequences that come through. And this brings me to another quote, once again by an economist, but I think it really does apply to foresight and futurism too, in that we could replace that word economics there with foresight and say that curious task of foresight practitioners and futurists is to convince people about how little they know about the systems they design. And here I'm talking about lag effects and those unintended consequences once again. When we're making decisions in crises, we can very often make choices that in the future are going to end up being very, very destructive, although that was not what they were intended to do. And this is why it's so important, or the role we play is so important, to encourage people to think through the second, third, fourth, fifth, even 10th, nth degree lag effects and ripple effects of the choices that are being made today. It's our role to actually slow people down in times of crisis, to think a little bit further forward ahead. And in this next part of my presentation, I want to talk a little bit about some of those trade-offs, some of those choices that have come about thanks to the current crisis, that perhaps we can start facilitating these conversations to make sure that by the time we get out of this particularly chaotic period, we are not setting ourselves up for something worse further down the road. Before I go on, although I frame them as choices, I want to be very clear that I'm talking here about sliders, so more like that knob or that dial than a simple switch. We should not be thinking too deterministically. It's not either or. We should rather be thinking more probabilistically about the choices that we face in terms of more or less instead of either and or. So I'd like you to frame that in your mind as I go through this next part of a few of the choices that we need to be helping people at an organizational and a governmental level to guide them through this next period. The first sort of sliding scale we need to consider as a second, third order effect of what comes out of the crisis, the choices we make right now, would be that of the difference between focus on the economy and focus on the environment. So this has been framed as a binary choice by quite a lot of people, and was framed like this even before the current COVID crisis came on board with all the climate change conversations that have been going around. We've been tricked into thinking that we have to choose between economic growth and environmental sustainability and things like climate change. And I think that what we've seen over the last few weeks as most of the world has been locked down, we've seen nature coming back. In fact, I had jackals in my back garden yesterday, which was quite unusual. We're starting to see that we could perhaps live a bit more in harmony with nature, but we should not then be too judgmental about switching that economy back on when we have to, because there are lives and livelihoods at stake, and things like industrialization and economic growth are highly correlated with longevity going into the future, particularly in the developed world and those emerging economies. So we really need to be thinking about how we can have both, not either or, and how we can find more middle ground. The next sort of sliding scale that we're looking at, that we've definitely seen coming to the fore, it's been a long-going mega trend that we've seen, and that's the switch, or that pendulum swing from globalism to nationalism. And of course, both sides come with both pros and cons. So on the globalist side, of course, the more the world is connected from a trade and human movement perspective, the less inequality between nations becomes. However, inequality within borders increases as globalism increases. That's once again a trade-off we have to look at. But always when we're talking about these trade-offs, we need to be framing things in terms of marginal returns. So there's a certain marginal return to any one of these choices, but at a certain point, then we need to pull back and find a bit more balance. Obviously, we don't want to swing too far in the other direction. And when we start talking about things like nationalism, risks of populism, of course, become quite important and quite threatening to national and international stability. Also coming on board, there would be things like censorship of the internet and things like the splinternet that's developing in a few of the more totalitarian governments and nations across the world, where governments are actually shutting off access to free flows of information and really balkanizing and isolating themselves in terms of communication, in terms of trade, through trade warfares, and even literally shutting down airports and movements of people. So we really need to consider, as we open up our economies later, to weigh off the benefits and, of course, the cons of things like globalization to make sure that we're getting inclusive growth for as many people as possible. The next sort of slide of trade-offs that we really have to consider very carefully as individuals and as organizations is how much of a pullback away from rights to things like privacy are we prepared to give up in the long term in exchange for a bit more safety. So in terms of a pandemic, there's been a lot of calls across the world to really pull back on a lot of the liberal humanitarian rights and values that have been long established in democratic nations for things like privacy, to say that you should be able to give your location and your diagnosis status over to authorities in exchange for creating a bit more of a safe society. But my challenge there would be, how do we build in then exit strategies to make sure that once the crisis is over, that we're not ending up in a completely surveilled world where privacy is no longer a valuable commodity. And from a business perspective, of course, privacy, a little bit of margin is in the mystery always. So a little bit of privacy, a little bit of protected information is actually good for our economy and for the society. We need to just find that balance once again. Very similarly, there's that sliding scale, that slippery slope between freedom of speech and censorship. That's finding the balance between cutting back on fake news and propaganda, and on the other hand, allowing things like freedom of speech to prosper without becoming draconian. So what is the world we really want to build when we get out of this? Very similarly, once again, it's a sliding scale between more democratic ways of running populations and countries and more authoritarian ones. I think one of the things that we've noticed from the current crisis is that authoritarianism is actually very effective at dealing with certain situations that democratic nations perhaps can't or won't do. But that doesn't mean that we should necessarily be throwing that proverbial baby out with the bathwater. So what is the society that we really want when we get out of it? What can we learn from each other? How can we find that middle ground? Of course, individualism and collectivism is very much the same thing once again. And for me, I think one of the more encouraging things to come out of that is that what we really want as a global community, as local communities, is to have more individual responsibility and to have more collective kindness. So we've seen people stepping up to help each other. How do we continue to encourage that without encouraging people to, perhaps let go of the individual agency to authorities? How can we create a global society of individuals who make choices for the greater good without being forced to by authorities? There's also the debate between what is better for society in terms of free market capitalism on the one hand and socialism on the other, because one of those really big mega trends that's been going on for many years now is the problem of inequality and how vastly unequal our global and local markets really are. And some of the calls that we're starting to see are things like universal basic income, which I think Spain is pushing ahead with quite strongly in the wake of the crisis. Once again, one of those ideas that was lying around that now has a chance to be run with. But of course, once again, they trade-offs, and we know this through society. There's always that push and pull, and it's finding the balance, and that's really what our role should be, to try to find the balance between those two economic worldviews to create a more stable society, but without then letting go of growth that could be useful for actually pulling more people out of poverty, for example. Following on from there, I thought I'd just mention there's another sort of trade-off developing in terms of how we actually run our monetary policy. So whether we're more neoliberal and relying on less government interference, or if we're moving towards, once again, another idea that's been lying around, the idea of modern monetary theory and how governments can just print money in times of crisis. But of course, once again, there's a difference then between the short term, when of course that helps us to perhaps reduce the depth of the economic fallout of what's going on, but in exchange for extending the crisis quite a lot. So taking a demand and supply shock and turning it into a monetary crisis that could last for a lot longer. So it's asking us to choose what our values are and how much pain we're prepared to take in the present for a more prosperous future. Very similarly there, once again, we're definitely seeing the fissures between the different generations getting a little bit deeper. There's been quite a lot of conflict between different generations across the world. We've seen this for some time. It's not something new, but it's something that's very much been exacerbated by what's going on with the crisis. In that, as you can see on the screen over there, one is a picture of some young people having a spring break at the same time that many elderly people were dying of COVID virus in Italy, and just the sort of difference in values between those groups. I'm not picking on younger people at all, because the larger conversation there going forward has been things like the social contract in terms of social security and social welfare, and how older people, older generations are perhaps benefiting more from systems that younger people will never actually be able to enjoy the fruits of, particularly in economies and markets where you've got an aging population, not enough young people to fulfill that social contract as they in turn get older. So I think that we need to find ways to address the conflict between different generations and to make sure we're perhaps engaging in life cycle consumption smoothing intergenerationally rather than just for ourselves as individuals. And as leaders in corporate and governmental spaces, those are the questions we should be asking: how to maximize utility beyond the current generations, not just to maximize utility for a particular generation or subset of your populations. And then this trade-off I think is quite interesting too, or this choice. The choice between the real world and the virtual world, and perhaps I spill a little bit more into futurism here, but talking about how being locked in home is really increasing our adoption of online, virtual, and digital escapism. And there is, of course, a danger that we end up spending too much time getting sucked into virtual escapism, and we end up with a whole generation of perhaps hikikomori people who are unable to re-engage and rebuild in the real world, as the real world becomes too difficult to contemplate. And of course, the real and the virtual world also has parallels with the economy. How can we create a virtual economy that's not dependent on scarce resources in the earth itself? So these are just interesting conversation starters of how we should start to frame the conversations with our clients and with the people that we work with, to make sure that we're looking at all of these different trade-offs, all of these different choices, and layering them across each other, because of course they all interact, and that's what makes life in human society so complex and so chaotic in the first place. And what all these trade-offs really are is it's a choice between short-termism and long-termism, and how do you find the balance between the two? How do we make sure that we're not mortgaging the future to pay for the past, and vice versa, that we're not shortchanging current people who have lives to live, only have one shot at life like we all do, in exchange for a future that perhaps is a bit hard to grasp hold of and that they will never be able to see the fruits of. And that's really the job of foresight, to try and find that balance, to try and rebuild that middle ground. And for me, the middle ground is a very interesting concept. So the middle ground can be seen both literally and figuratively. And what I think the current particular patch of chaos and crisis is really doing is it's getting us to see how fragile the middle really is, how little common ground we have between these binary worlds of the view of the world, and how important it is to rebuild that middle, to make sure that we are finding more middle ground. But on the more literal space, I think that we're also finding that the current crisis is really putting pressure on the middle segment of our populations. That would be your middle class consumers, your smaller businesses, your freelancers, your gig workers, that precariat class, as I think they're being called by some economists. And really that middle class, or that middle segment of society, is to a large extent what democracies are built upon, everyone having a stake in the rewards and the risks of the economy. And I think that it makes a nice metaphor then to go back to the fact that really what we need to be doing is finding middle ways, finding compromises, and finding a path forward that's going to be as inclusive as many people as possible. Otherwise, we are setting ourselves up for quite some dystopian futures ahead. So to end with, I picked up this quote from Alexander Gray, who I think is great, where he says that no utopia has ever been described in which any sane man would on any condition consent to live if he could possibly escape. And I think that is another very important point to make as futurists and as foresight workers, that we are making sure that we are not engaging in prescriptive future visions when we start getting into scenarios we didn't really get into today, and we start looking at how the world should be or could be in the future. We should be opening up realms of possibility. That should be our realm, that should be our role, rather than narrowing it down to one particular view of what the world should be. For me, I very much think that there is no one-size-fits-all utopia, and our job as futurists is to increase the options available to people, to get more voices involved in the future, to find more middle ground, to find more ideas, not less. And so really what that really comes down to is being comfortable with divergence, being comfortable with more different futures that we could find ourselves in, being comfortable with just a little bit of chaos. And that's really what our role is, to help people, as I said a bit earlier, to prepare not for everything, because that is impractical for a world where we have limited resources, but rather to be ready for anything. And that's really all I have for you today. Thank you very much. Okay, there you go, I can see now. Okay, so the first question is, what people will need a virtual economy? Or better to ask, will a virtual economy need people? I think absolutely it will. So a virtual economy is quite an interesting concept. So it's this idea that we can create value for each other without relying on scarce physical resources. So there's some interesting examples there. The first one would be in the fashion space. So we've definitely seen people starting to sell virtual garments, which is very interesting, because we all know that fast fashion is highly destructive on the economy and on the environment. But virtual clothing allows us to differentiate ourselves when we are interacting like we are today in the virtual space, but still being able to express our personality. So in that way, designers are able to sell designs to people, to consumers, in a way that doesn't actually impact on scarce resources or increase pollution going on in the world. Now, what we've also seen, like right now with the current crisis, as people have been locked down, is how much work is done in the virtual space. There will always be a real economy. I don't believe that's going anywhere at all. But rather what we can say is that there's also space for growth in the virtual space, and we can start building virtual cities and creating cities of bits, for example, where we connect with each other and trade with each other, trade ideas, trade creativity, trade projects that don't rely on literally pulling things out of the earth and rebuilding and reselling them. So I hope that answers to a certain extent. Next question over here, we've got, what do you think about equality versus diversity? Isn't equality often enforced at the cost of diversity in developing nations? I think that's a very good question, and equality implies that continues on to say equality implies a one-size-fits-all, doesn't it? Well, yes, of course, there's always that sliding scale between liberty and equality, and that's the challenge of policymakers, to find an acceptable balance between the two. And it's probably the hardest government challenge, the hardest policy challenge in the world, because it is a trade-off. The more sort of liberty you get on one side, the more diversity of ideas you have, the less equality you're able to have in practical terms. And equality is, of course, very difficult to describe, because what is equal? Because what do you measure your equality on? Do you measure it in financial terms? Do you measure it in success terms? Do you measure it in enjoyment terms? So it's a very difficult metric, but it is something that's worth trying to get closer towards. And I think the challenge there is when you put that word into the question there, when you said enforced. And I think that what we should be doing as policymakers and as system designers is to create a system that allows for as much equality as possible to emerge, rather than trying to enforce equality top down. It's got to come bottom up. So that would be my answer there, although I'm sure it is very incomplete. The next question is, how do you envisage breaking the gap between generations? Well, I think that the best thing we need to look at there, if we want to bridge the gap between generations, is to understand that people are not that different. A person in their 60s was not that different to a 20-year-old today when they were 20. And I think that's where a lot of generational science, when you start looking at trends, gets a little bit wrong, in that they're not different people in those different generational cohorts so much as they are in different stages of their lives. And I think the way that we can start building more commonality there is through ensuring that our systems, particularly our social security net systems, are not skewed in the favor of a particular group. Because when a younger generation feels that they are being taken advantage of in order to support someone else's lavish retirement when they're in the midst of an economic crisis, that's when those real big fishes do tend to come through. On a corporate space, what we found is that when we start working with different generations within a workplace, we can see how much commonality there really is between people and how people's values and needs and desires are very much the same. What is different is just their place in life and their particular needs at that point in time. So there has to be a lot more information sharing. There also has to be a lot more understanding of what I'm giving today, I am going to get further along the line, but that requires some sort of trust that the policies that we're investing in as young people today will be there for us to reap the rewards of as we get older. So making sure, once again, the skin in the game is equitably distributed in terms of rewards and risks for all parties. Next question here is, what strategies and tools have proven effective for modeling complex system dynamics to inform public policy and social services? So I think that that's not an easy question to answer for me, because I don't do a lot of public policy work in terms of doing that. But the strategies and tools that do work are strategies and tools that involve more voices and that are not prescriptive. So I think that's where a lot of policy foresight falls down, in that it's done behind closed doors with academics, with futurists and professionals and government workers, but it does not include too many younger people or local people on the ground. And when it comes to policy, you have to include all those different voices to make sure that every single stakeholder does have skin in the game. So I know there was a very intense, very in-depth set of scenarios called the Diner King scenarios that were done to that end here in South Africa, but it was something that only people that worked in the future space or in government ever knew about. And if you're setting foresight and scenarios and programs and ideas in place, if you don't have the buy-in or even the knowledge of your citizenry, there's absolutely no way that those visions will come to fruition, because it requires everyone in your society, everyone in your organization pulling towards the same goal. So I think that there's a big gap there in terms of communication and in terms of involving lay people and not being too prescriptive or too white tower, ivory tower-ish when we start doing plans and putting processes together. I really do think the future should be democratized and available and open to as many people as possible to contribute their ideas. Otherwise, you do end up with prescriptive futures rather than descriptive ones that explore the various different options that we could have on the table. Okay, so we got someone asking for some insights about the different generations, X, Y, Z, and what are the drivers for them right now. So I'll start with Generation X, or that'll be the sort of 40-year-olds at the moment, or actually a little bit older, sort of 40 to 50-year-old bracket right now. They are currently probably bearing the brunt of the economic fallout at the moment. They are in middle age, so they tend to have older grown-up children. And as we know today, older grown-up children tend to stay at home for a little bit longer. So I know a lot of financial pressure at the moment. We did some research with one of our clients here in South Africa, and we found that they're pretty stressed and depressed at the moment. They're also struggling in the workplace, because unlike younger generations, they didn't enter into the workplace with technology like the internet and computers and all the rest of it. They've had to adapt to that as things came along. So what they're finding is they're caught between the old world and the new world quite a lot. And there's a lot of workplace and financial stress on that particular group. And moving down the chain, you've got Generation Y, that'd be also known as the millennial generation, and they are currently sort of in your young professional sort of age group. They are now, millennials aren't that young anymore. Millennials are pushing 40 at the moment, so they're pretty much between sort of late 20s to around about 40 years old at the moment. They're starting to have children. The big challenge for me with the millennial generation is that unlike older generations, they don't have much in the way of hard assets. So this is a lot to do with the trends of like the sharing economy and the gig economy, and how for people, and I'm a millennial, around about my age, we don't need to own homes and cars and assets per se, because we can have access to all those sharing economy services. The vulnerability comes in then from an economic perspective, in that millennials don't have a lot of hard assets to fall back on in times of economic crisis. So I like to draw the parallel between the sharing economy and the rentier economy, as I say. So the sharing economy is the shiny side of the new technology platform-based economy where we access a service rather than buying a product, owning an asset. But the flip side of that is that sharing economy technology, those large platforms, have created a large generational class of renters who rent not just their homes, they rent pretty much everything. You don't even own software on your computer. Many people don't even own their computer or own their phone. It's all rented and paid for. And of course, if you go back to sort of classic economics and old Adam Smith and all the rest of it, he was very clear in saying that a rentier-based economy where a lot of value accrues to a centralized point doesn't make for a very stable economy or a very equitable economy. So I'd say that's probably the millennial generation's largest economic challenge. And then moving right down to the Zs. So the Zs would pretty much be teenagers to in their early 20s at the moment. In South Africa, we call them the born-free generation because they would be the first generation to be born after the fall of apartheid. In South Africa, we have a youth bulge where we've got a lot of Generation Zs. In the rest of the world, the Generation Z is a lot smaller because the population graphs or trees or pyramids are slightly differently shaped, particularly in the aging populations of most of your prosperous Western countries. But Generation Z is very interesting, or the Gen Zs, in that they've been brought up in a world of complete chaos and change. So many of them would have been very young children when the Twin Towers event happened. They've lived through now 2 recessions, the 2008 one and the current pandemic. They also lived through the war on terror and the threat of terrorism. What's interesting with this younger generation is that they are seeming to be more financially independent or more open to ideas of things like entrepreneurship, which is of course very interesting. I think the reason for that is that they have seen through the economic crisis of the last decade that having a job and having a salary is in no way as secure as it was for previous generations. Indeed, for what a lot of people are finding right now is whole countries and nations are locked down, that perhaps the most secure place you could be financially is if you're working for yourself rather than working for someone else. At least you're in control of your own destiny. The other thing to notice about Generation Z, as we've nicknamed them in South Africa, is these are generation activists. Out of this generation, we're seeing young people that are very passionate about not just complaining about what's going on in the world, but actually acting out against it. So you've got everyone from Greta and taking on the climate change challenge to Josh Wong taking on the challenge of democracy in the East. And he's done some interesting things too, things like starting to protest on video games, coming back to the virtual economy there. But those just be a couple of broad strokes thoughts on the different generations. Next question. You say there's no one-size-fits-all utopia. How does the idea of anarchy fit in there? Anarchy not in terms of no law, but anarchy where each person has his own living terms. That for me is a very interesting question, and I spend quite a lot of time looking at new governance models, at different radical incentive-based market structures, both economically speaking and politically speaking. And I spend a lot of time to that end looking at what's going on in the crypto community, in the blockchain space. And there are some very interesting ideas coming out of there about self-sovereign identity and about self-governance. So instead of you having your set of rules, your governance tied to the place where you just happen to be born, rather you get to choose the sort of governments, the sort of rules that you want to live by, and you lock yourself into a contract in the virtual space. So once again, it's this concept of borderless nations, but it's still giving people choice, because I think that's very, very important. That for me, probably the biggest dystopia would be if the whole entire world was forced into a particular model of governance, because many people would not agree with that. So more choice is definitely better, and some of the new technologies where we can start thinking very creatively about entirely new systems where we can actually design our own governance models and live by them are definitely worth looking into. So that would be people like Pangaea and BitNation. There's lots of things that you can look up there, very interesting. Next question, what would I recommend to find more middle grounds in these times of polarization? Well, I think the first thing to do is, particularly us who work in this foresight and futures space, is to be very clear about the fact that choices shouldn't be framed in either or framings, that we have to frame things in terms of sliders, in terms of compromise, in terms of getting comfortable with the gray area and the chaos in between, the neat, simple solutions. I think it's very important for us to not say there are simple solutions. We live in a messy world. It's a human world, and the messy human world requires messy human solutions, which are not simple, neat, and tied up in a bow. And once again, this does involve involving more voices, and that's people that have diversity, not just of skin color or demographics, but diversity of ideas, diversity of background in as much of our research and work as possible. The more people your work influences, the more different voices you have to include in order to find that middle ground. And what's quite interesting there would be to look at the V-Taiwan project, how the Taiwanese government has started looking to get common ground between very dissenting views, using technology, using artificial intelligence, to not divide people like we see on social media, but to rather find points of commonality. So I definitely encourage you to look up the V-Taiwan system if you're looking at a more practical way to actually start finding that middle ground. Next question, how to help the SMEs in smaller companies. I'm living in Milan, our livelihood is based on smaller industries, and innovation and crisis requires immediate action, how to balance the future and now. So I'm quite passionate about that. I live in South Africa, as I said, we have a huge problem with unemployment. SMEs account for about 30% of our employment, or 30% of our GDP and about 60% of our employment, and most of them have less than a month's cash runway. In other words, most of those businesses are going to go bankrupt, out of business, before we get out of the lockdown period. So for me, I think it is very important for policymakers and governments to be very conscious about where they are putting the cash and the aid when it comes to, if you are printing money, if you are loosening the fiscal budgets, we need to be applying money where it's going to be most useful. And that's not to bail out big businesses and big banks. It should really be going towards SMEs that really drive the economy and improve things like employment. Employment is going to be a huge problem by the end of this. We need to save what needs to be saved. We need to engage in sort of fiscal triage, save the businesses that are able to get over this period. We do need to be investing in them, because that missing middle for me is probably the biggest concern. Because if the middle falls out of a market or an economy, that's when societies become very, very destabilized. Most revolutions to become very dystopian, just for a second there, are driven out of the middle class that feels that is either losing its position or is unable to ever improve itself. So when you take hope away from that middle segment of a society, and up in a very, very dangerous place. On the other side, because I always like to talk not just about top-down solutions, but bottom-up solutions, I would absolutely encourage individuals to try and support small businesses through that. So we know there's a lot of platforms that are offering things like buying a voucher now for your favorite small business to try and help them through the next period, so they can just manage their cash flow a bit, and also voting with your wallet as well as your vote. So if you want to build your local community, support local businesses rather than large multinational chains, and be very, very conscious about how we are spending our money. That goes to businesses too, making sure that you are supporting your local supply chains first, and thinking about that sort of collective kindness and collective solidarity within our communities, because we are really all in this together. The next question here is, in the current crisis, we find ourselves currently at the level of chaoticness going all around the world. How can we better prepare ourselves for the next? Well, I think I covered some of that in the talk, in that there is going to be another crisis that's going to come around. We don't know what it is. The next crisis is not going to be like this crisis. So that comes back to that balance between preparedness of practicalities and preparedness of mindset. And I think developing a mindset where we are comfortable with change, and where we develop weatherproof, transportable skills and resiliencies is the best way to prepare us to go forward. And that comes back to adding value to society, which is something that I haven't really touched on today. But resilient business models, resilient individuals, resilient nations add value to the global community rather than simply extracting value. And that comes back once again to hollowing out of the economy and the importance of that middle segment of the economy, because that's where a lot of the value is being created and a lot of value is being extracted by very big businesses on the side and also by very expensive welfare nets. Rather, we want to be building that codependent, self-sufficient class of our economy. That's how we build a much more resilient community rather than relying on welfare on the one end or bailouts on the other end. And I think that's probably a few ways or a few thoughts, issues or directions where my thinking goes. How is it possible? I like this question. So let's say, how is it possible the global economy was so shocked by a COVID-19 situation, having experience from global crisis in 2008? Well, I think that what's happened this time is we managed to get ourselves into a panic cycle. What we have this time that we haven't had in previous crises is the other viral effect. That's the viral effect of social media. And media has been quite a dangerous partner in the current pandemic, first underplaying the risk, the real risk, and then perhaps perpetuating panic at just exactly the wrong time. So I think that our particular time now was not that we didn't know how to be prepared for these sort of crises. There are only so many hospitals and so many beds that any particular country can have or can support or can afford at any given point in time. The crisis, as I said, really came about because of leadership and fear to actually act in the moment, not a lack of preparedness of what could happen, political will to make the hard choices when it was most important to make them. So I think that really we have to put that into the ball of the court of our leaders who were perhaps not as proactive as they should have been if information was on the table for them.